So my name is Nathalie. I am one of the co-founders and head of strategy at DEUS, and I also host the Human-Centered AI podcast, where I interview people in the field of artificial intelligence. And at DEUS, we help organizations apply artificial intelligence in a way that is human and humanity-centered. Now, before I co-founded DEUS, I helped global enterprises and corporate ventures create value with broader emerging technologies. I did that at Accenture Interactive in my role as innovation program lead. And before that, I graduated in artificial intelligence. I always say in a time when it was talked about a lot less than it is talked about today. So a lot has changed in those last couple of years. Now, before I dive into human-centered AI, let me start by giving you a very short introduction about DEUS and also our perspective when it comes to AI and developing AI applications or implementing AI. Now, in short, we always say that we empower organizations to advance value creation with data and artificial intelligence. But I think there's a lot more behind that, because our name, DEUS, is a reference to Deus Ex Machina, which you may have guessed. But at the same time, DEUS is also an acronym for our core 4 disciplines that we think are needed to develop AI products and services. And those are data science, so that's the D, engineering, the E, user experience, and strategy. And so I'm representing the S within the DEUS letters. And then if you look at our core team, we started DEUS together with 6 partners, and 4 of us represent those different letters. And those core pillars, and are building teams around that. Now, when we started DEUS, we basically noticed that there were a lot of companies entering the AI space or in the AI space and really focused on, let's say, the more technical side of artificial intelligence, or perhaps also the business side, like how to make AI products and services that are viable, but not so much on the human side of things. And really, we were missing this interdisciplinary approach that combined different perspectives within the field of artificial intelligence, and that is what we set out to do. So now, 1.5 years later, we are now almost 40 people based out of the Netherlands, out of Spain, and also out of Portugal. Now, when we describe what we do at DEUS, we always say we're an AI company on one hand, but also maybe you wouldn't label us as an AI company per se. Because the reason that is we believe that technology and data and artificial intelligence, they're really a means to an end. They're not the end goal on its own. They're not the end itself. We always see that our #1 goal that we're trying to achieve is simply creating value that is for business, for people, and ideally for society as a whole. And we see that data and artificial intelligence can be those fantastic assets that enable you to create value, but only when they're the right solution to the challenge that you're facing. So as a whole, we're focused on humans and their needs so that we can identify and build solutions that are viable, so creating benefits for the business, feasible, possible to be built, as well as desirable, things that people actually want and benefit from. And finally, beyond those 3, desirability, feasibility, and viability, it is the most important thing to do that with integrity. So making sure that the solutions that we build actually impact people positively. And that's not only the people that we're considering to be our users, but also people we're not considering to be our users, but who may actually be affected by the things that we build. So we call this approach human as well as humanity-centered, hence the brackets. And that is what I'm here to talk to you about today. So now that you know a little bit more about DEUS and our background, you might be wondering, hey, where is this notion of human-centered AI actually coming from, and why do we need it? And so to answer this right now in 2021, I think it actually helps to look at the past and the history of the field of AI as a whole, so that you understand the field and also understand the link to why we need human-centered AI. Now, I know you're all IT students, so you probably are not new to artificial intelligence, But let me very quickly recap where it actually came from so you understand human-centered AI. So AI was born in, the field was born in 1956 at a workshop in Dartmouth College. And at the time, there was a group of researchers, and they proposed to basically conduct a study into what they then named artificial intelligence. And they formed this entire study based on the premise that artificial intelligence, or learning, should be able to be described in a way that allows machines to simulate it. And also, if you look at the description of the field, and maybe also based from your experience studying IT and studying AI, you may notice that it is really focused on creating systems that emulate human behavior and creating autonomous systems. So systems that can perceive their environment, take actions, and then also maximize their chances of successfully achieving their goals. And this was something that, historically speaking, you could really see in all the examples that were attempted to be made. So, for example, one of the first chatbots, Eliza, she was called, was really focused on creating this system that could operate on its own. But as well as, if we're looking around right now, the Teslas, self-driving cars, the goal is really an autonomous system. Cars that can drive themselves, not necessarily as an end goal cars that are supported by humans and can drive themselves, even though that is the case right now. Now, in the last few years, there have been these growing concerns around this idea of whether fully autonomous systems should really be the end goal that we're aiming for as a field. Now, let me give you an example of that, and one that I find very contextual as you're all students. So last year, because of the pandemic that happened, maybe you've seen this actually, it was all over the news in The Guardian, and I think even some Dutch newspapers it was covered. But what happened was that the exams in the UK couldn't take place. And what the examinations office then decided to do was to create a grade standardization algorithm. Now, the reason they wanted to do this was because they noticed that if teachers were to assess student grades, they actually tend to be inflated. So teachers tend to inflate the grades of their students. Kind of nice of them, but not ideal. So that's why, you know, in the UK, they decided, hey, let's create a grade standardization algorithm so that we can prevent grade inflation, and so that everyone gets kind of their grade that they should have gotten if they were to take the exam. Now, the main issue was how they actually then chose to do that. Because, and I think this is already giving half of the story away, the data that was fed into the algorithm was actually taking into account the previous results of the schools. And what that meant was that if you went to a private school, you actually got better predicted grades because, historically speaking, private schools got better grades. Kids in public schools, on the other hand, they really saw their predicted grades being reduced significantly for the only reason that their school's past performance was taken into account. Nothing to do with themselves, but all to do with historical data of school and the kids' performance there. And as a result of that, lots of students were actually losing their university placements. And they went to the streets, had massive protests around that, including this one, which I mean, says it all. Computer science students could have made a better algorithm. Now, the thing that is actually really unusual of this example is that in this situation, actually so many people across the UK were affected. And that included people who had a voice and could use that voice to, you know, provoke change and inspire change. And I think the larger part of the story is that, you know, decisions, they're increasingly powered by predictive algorithms. We all know this. But a lot of times, they're affecting people, marginalized groups, in ways that are worse than others, and they don't actually always have the voice to speak up and also be listened to. And that's what's quite different here, because so many people were affected. Now, I think this begs the question of, okay, what could they have done? Because on one hand, it is understandable that in the UK, they could not have fully relied on teachers' assessments as they tend to be inflated. But there's this huge space between putting this into the hands of humans, so the teachers, versus completely automating it with an algorithm whose results turn into negative effects for many students across the country. And so this is where the notion of human-centered AI comes in, because human-centered AI is shifting the focus away from the idea that a fully autonomous system should be the end goal, towards a system that kind of augments human capabilities. So it kind of like, I don't know, I always think it sounds pretty obvious, but if you look at the recent history of artificial intelligence, the field was not focused on building augmentative systems. It was focused on building autonomous systems and algorithmic performance. So with human-centered AI, it's really about shifting the focus away and putting people at the center and developing solutions that augment human performance rather than replace human performance. So to summarize all that, shifting away the focus from automation as the end goal towards augmentation, human performance, like how does this affect humans, over algorithmic performance. So not only looking at how accurate your machine learning model is, but actually, hey, is this application or algorithm actually desirable for the people that it is affecting or the people that it is designed for? And at the same time, human-centered AI really emphasizes socially responsible solutions and also human values and human goals. And in the end, to bring it all together, it looks at AI that is in the benefit of humans, not only a certain group of humans, humanity, and also enforcing fundamental rights like privacy and equality and fairness and democracy. And I just want to make a quick note to say that, you know, this whole need of human-centered AI, it's not an entirely new observation. You have research fields like human-computer interaction, as well as science and technology studies, and they've been focusing on these topics for decades. But what really changed, especially in those last few years, was that a number of academic institutions were established, really in response to how AI is increasingly affecting people's lives, and also kind of in light of the concerns of AI not benefiting people. And you can see that in institutions like the Stanford Institution for Human-Centered AI, but as well as in Utrecht. I know that in University of Utrecht, there is an institution focused on human-centered AI as well. And they're really emphasizing that, you know, the next wave of AI is not just technological, but it is humanistic and it is ethical. So to augment humans rather than replace them is the main takeaway here. Now, what I want to do now is share a couple of examples with you of some of the themes within human-centered AI, so that you get a bit of an understanding of the different touch points that the field is concerned with. And I always want to, you know, I think it is always useful if you look at your current work or your current assignment or what you're working on right now in terms of app development, or I don't know what else exciting stuff you're working on, and just think along about these themes and about these questions and see where they overlap with the work or assignments you've done, and maybe whether they prompt any questions or considerations that you might want to be making. So I'll go through these themes, some examples, and yeah, I'm also curious to hear later from you within the comments or within the questions afterwards, some of your thoughts on them. All right, so starting with ethics. Now, I think you're probably also within your studies, you may have had a subject or two about ethics. It definitely has been getting lots of attention over these last couple of years, not only within academia, but also within lots of prominent large enterprises and institutes all over the world. And you see that a lot of them are establishing these ethical guidelines and, you know, communicating about their values and goals, etc. But yeah, you know, guidelines are great, but they only have value when they're actually acted upon within your work. So I think there's a number of questions that you can easily be asking to kind of look at, determining what a good outcome even is for an application that you're working on, and also looking at, hey, okay, so if something is a good outcome, for who is that a good outcome? Is it a good outcome for everyone, or is it maybe only a good outcome for some people and not for others? And so these are just some questions that you typically want to be asking and also include in the process of creating AI applications, so to say. Now, ethics, I would say, is a massive field on its own. But one of the things that is very commonly discussed concerning AI and ethics is the topic of unintended consequences. So I just want to share an example around that with you. And you may be very familiar with this. So I think the best way to understand unintended consequences are social media platforms. And basically, they're personalization algorithms that they're using. Now, if you interact with lots of cat videos, you get shown lots of cat videos. At the same time, if you interact with climate denier content, you get shown more climate denier content that is just, reiterating your views towards you and emphasizing that what you're actually thinking is probably true because you get shown the same things. Now, I think where the topic of ethics and AI comes in is because those platforms, they're not optimizing for, let's say, true or objective content. They're optimizing for you to increase the time that you spend on their platform so that they can show you more ads and also make more money off of you. So these platforms, they're optimizing for engagement, which is a choice that they're making. The unintended consequence of that is that they tend to draw us into our own bubbles of belief. Now, what you see here in the background is a website called ThereTube. And I would really recommend, just hit it up in your Google search bar and look it up, because it's a website where you can explore how different types of users actually get sucked into their own beliefs. So you can see what a homepage of a climate denier looks like, or a fruitarian, or someone who has very conservative views, and just see how their views are being reflected back to them. Which wasn't necessarily the intention of the platform, but it's definitely the unintended consequence of their optimization techniques. Now, I also want to give you some tools that you can actually use or think about when you are developing AI products and services. So one of the people who's doing some really interesting work in this space that you can explore and look at is Kenneth Bowles. He wrote a book called Future Ethics. And he's really looking at how you can combine ethics in technology with things like speculative design and also future studies methods, translating those ethical questions into practice. Now, on the left here, you see a speculative prototype. So those are basically prototypes that are not meant to be built, but they're literally there to provoke. So to get a better understanding of what would happen if you'd introduced something like that to the world. How would people respond to it? And so in this case, the designers of this provocatype, they looked at a scenario where we would live in a world where energy is scarce, and an algorithm would decide who would be able to charge your car and who would get priority. So for example, a doctor would get priority, and perhaps someone with a criminal record would be deprioritized. Now, of course, this doesn't sound like a super realistic scenario. Maybe in the future it will be. But the researchers used this to get an understanding and provoke people of thinking about these things and thinking about the consequences of introducing such systems to the world. Now, imagine if, the earlier example regarding the exams, if they would have done something similar, if they simply created a prototype and see how it could affect people, and maybe they would have learned from that, like, hey, maybe we should not make this algorithm, maybe there's a different way, or there's a different way where humans and the algorithm could collaborate. So that's one thing that is a really interesting way to just get a better idea of how a solution may affect people. Now, in the middle, you see a little prompt burst that says prompting externalities. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically externalities are the people who are affected by the work that you do, who you may have not considered to be affected. So basically, let's say you're putting a solution out there to the world, and it may actually end up affecting different users or different people, different target groups than you intended to. Now, by using little prompts, you can actually use those to explore and inquire how your solution is actually affecting groups that you may not have considered. Maybe it's affecting the earth, maybe it's affecting certain voters, etc. So just something to get you thinking, and yeah, maybe you can apply it within your own work. Now, the topic of ethics is very strongly linked to fairness. And at least for those of you who are studying AI or perhaps data science, you're probably familiar with this notion. In terms of the definition of fairness, there's not really a global definition of what fairness is. It's always very contextual. So in the context of algorithms, pretty much all definitions of fairness, they focus on guaranteeing some sort of equality or shared benefit, let's say, across the different types of people or groups that are affected by what you're making. So when working with AI, a very important outcome to avoid is creating or reinforcing biases that lead to unfair outcomes. Now, to do so, you need to be aware of what types of biases may actually be in the data so that you can correct for that. I think something nice to have as a reference point, because maybe you have studied bias, maybe not, within your study, so I don't want to go too deep into it. But I really like this research paper, which was published, I think it was last year, which is called A Framework for Understanding the Unintended Consequences for Machine Learning. And what they've done here is they outline all the different types of biases that can occur within the machine learning pipeline. When I say all of them, I probably have like missaid that, but at least some of the high level ones it has outlined. Now, I think when we're talking about biases, I mean, we're in the light of machine learning and AI, we're always talking about them with quite a negative connotation. But cognitive biases are inherent in human decision making. On a daily basis, we make very biased decisions, and at the same time, biases have helped us, run away from dangerous species and also survive. Now, the thing with predictive algorithms is obviously that they amplify these human biases and scale them widely. And I think a very good example of where that almost went wrong was with an AI recruiting tool that Amazon was exploring to build. I don't think they actually ever launched it because they pulled the plug on time. But I still think it's quite a good example. Because basically, they created this machine learning model, and they used the resumes that were submitted to the company over a period of, I think it was at least 10 years' time. And then they looked at, hey, okay, so we got these resumes. Who of those went on to get hired? Who went on to succeed within the company and grow into, let's say, managerial roles? And what happened was that they found out that the algorithm ended up kind of teaching itself that men were preferable hires. Now, it's not really a surprise if you look at the data, because especially if you're looking at 10 years ago from now, most of the resumes they've received, they came from men. And that's simply reflecting male dominance in tech. It's just a reality. And because of that, it actually just ended up penalizing the resumes that included words like women's. Things like women's chess club captain was actually not a good thing to have on your resume. And I think the moral of the story, so to say, is that fairness, whether it's with intention or not, in the end, it's not decided by algorithms. It's decided by humans who make the algorithms and the data that they choose to put into that, and the organizations that put it out in the world. Because algorithms, in the end, all they do, as you know, they learn what is present within the data. And if your history wasn't perfect, your historical data isn't perfect. So you're going to have to correct for those imperfections in one way or the other. And that's also something that the field of human-centered AI is concerned with, and this entire domain, obviously, of fairness and accountability and transparency within artificial intelligence. Which leads us to the next theme within human-centered AI, transparency. Now, transparency, very important for various reasons, I would say. So first of all, especially in Europe, we have to deal with GDPR. So one part is simply legal, complying to regulations. On the other hand, transparency is incredibly important for gaining the trust of the users that are going to use the system that you're building. And also to ensure that people are even using the system in the way that you intended it to be used. And at the same time, even to verify whether or not the machine learning model that you're making is actually working as you expected it to work. Now, I'm going to share with you my all-time favorite example for transparency and explainability. Because, I mean, first of all, who doesn't love dogs? But beyond that, this was basically a study where researchers wanted to create a machine learning model that was able to distinguish wolves from huskies. So wolves and huskies, they look a lot like each other. I see a comment, haha, Snow, and you're indeed right on track. Now, basically, what they did, they trained a model and to distinguish wolves from huskies, and they managed to get about, I think it was about like 90% accuracy, which sounds great, right? What turned out was that the model was basing its entire classification only on the background, indeed, snow. Because wolves are usually photographed with a snowy background in the wild. Whereas huskies, they can be photographed on the street, on a pavement, on wherever. And by only looking at the accuracy, we wouldn't have been able to spot that the model only looked at the background, not at the dog or husky itself. And so I think transparency and explainability of your outcomes are so important, even to understand, whether the machine learning model is actually working in the way that you thought it would. Because imagine this was your mortgage application, or imagine this was something like another incredibly important decision or outcome that you were trying to get as a person. It could affect you in incredibly negative ways if your algorithm isn't making the decision based on what you thought it would. So this is really where the field of explainable AI comes in, and also the trade-off between accuracy as well as explainability that needs to be made when choosing a machine learning model. And I think especially in certain industries like finance, this is increasingly important because complex machine learning techniques, they may increase the accuracy, but they often decrease the degree of explainability because, as you know, they take into account millions of variables. And so you can actually look at this trade-off and explore this by looking at the needs of the different stakeholders that are affected by what you're making. So which people are going to use it, who is affected by it, and use that information to assess what level of explainability is actually desired for the solution you're trying to build. Now, there's many ways to look at explainability. I mean, you can look at it after building a model, and I know that there are more and more developments taking place that are increasing the explainability even in more complicated models. But at the same time, what I just explained now, you can also really look at explainability before starting to develop something. And this is something that one of our graduate students at DEUS researched last year. And he really looked at the pre-modeling considerations in terms of explainability. So really looking at, hey, what can we do to determine the needs of different stakeholders? And identifying the different types of factors that you can use before actually starting to build a model that can inform your choice of, hey, this type of model may be more suitable than this type of model. So yeah, I hope maybe this gives you some ideas or prompts to take into account within your projects that you're working on. And yeah, next up, I do want to talk a little bit about privacy. And well, beyond GDPR, which I mentioned already before, privacy is a key topic within artificial intelligence. And I think, like I said, GDPR isn't the only reason we need to be thinking about privacy. There are a number of questions we want to be asking in the first place regarding the privacy of users and their rights. And also, getting that understanding of, hey, could we actually build the same application by using perhaps less data or less personally identifiable data? Is it really needed? Now, I think that when talking about privacy, one of the first things that comes to people's minds is also the situation that is happening within China regarding their credit scoring system, in which, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but practically everything is tracked of citizens there with that system, what they buy, where they go, how they behave, and they're using advanced predictive algorithms and facial recognition to score how responsible and trustworthy their citizens are. Now, if you have a good rating, you can get benefits like priority healthcare or deposit-free renting, which sounds pretty great. But if you have a negative rating, you can actually get a negative result, like, in an extreme case, things like being banned from public transport. This always seems like a very Black Mirror-y scenario that we wouldn't really expect here in the Netherlands or in Western countries. But even here, surveillance is also happening. Now, in September last year, Amnesty International, they published a report on predictive policing within the Netherlands, and then specifically what happened in Roermond. Maybe you're familiar with this. This was also all over the news. But in this case, what happened was that a predictive algorithm was created to simply estimate the risk of a person committing a crime or a crime occurring in a certain location. And with the algorithm, the police was able to focus on people or locations that were identified as high risk and explore further. Again, I guess it sounds pretty useful on the surface, but what's happening is that the data of all the vehicles inside and outside of Roermond was registered. And so that is one thing. Whether they consented to it or not, it was registered. Based on monitoring vehicles and their movement patterns, the police calculated the risk the algorithm, and high-risk vehicles were able to be stopped by the police and they could check the passengers. Now, in this case, the people who were living in Roermond or entering Roermond were used in an experiment that they didn't really consent to in the first place, violating privacy rights and also resulting in ethnic profiling. And so, prejudice and biases, they influence the outputs of these predictive algorithms, and they're often impacting minorities and marginalized communities the most. So I think this is another consideration to be making when you're developing AI solutions, not only focusing on the accuracy of the model, but understanding how it affects people's privacy rights and whether it could negatively affect certain marginalized communities. I have two more examples to share with you, and then I think we're almost through our time here as well. But I think this one is very important and not spoken about enough, which is human agency. So human agency is really the capacity for humans like yourself and like me to make choices and impose those choices on the world. So whenever you're thinking about human agency, it is really about asking questions like, how can we augment human capabilities and allow humans to make choices rather than making those choices for them, especially in situations where this is highly undesirable. So to debunk this a little bit, many current AI systems like recommenders that are all around us when we're reading the news or listening to Spotify or Netflix or watching Netflix, but they try to do a thing where they avoid information overload, which is a good intention, I guess, as a starting point. At the same time, what's happening is that they're really replacing our decision-making processes simply by predictions of what content we would like most, so what content we would engage with most. So as you see here in this example, you read one article, in this case about Boris Johnson, and core concepts that are linked to the related concepts provide you with related news. Now, this always begs the question, like, how can we actually design and build these recommender systems in ways that, rather than replacing our decision-making, actually promote our agency? So allowing these systems to support our decision-making rather than replacing them. And as an answer to that, this is an example from Caroline Cinders, who is a machine learning design researcher and artist. And basically, in a talk, she explained how she ruined her Spotify weekly algorithm during her breakup, where she kept listening to Mumford & Sons. And I think all of you can relate. You know, you listen to Spotify and you listen to a few bad tracks, and you know your next Spotify weekly is full of related tracks to that, even though that may not have been your intention. Now, what Caroline did was she came up with this concept, which I think is a really nice example of how we can think of giving back human agency and giving back control to humans when using those self-learning systems, which is a very simple way of allowing you to edit your data. Now, I know that the technical constraints around this are definitely challenging, but I think it is a good example of, you know, thinking about machine learning and thinking about AI and where the field can be going, and giving back human agency to people rather than simply applying a predictive model and not allowing for humans to adjust their outcomes or making choices and imposing those choices on the platforms that they're using. So food for thought. Now, finally, I just want to close off with human-AI interaction. You also may have, I don't know how it is these days. I remember in my studies, we had one course regarding human-computer interaction, and I think this is very much related to it. So about understanding human needs, understanding the user needs, and also identifying how those needs can be complemented with an AI solution. And at the same time, how you actually then make that solution and design it to be user-friendly. So tapping into existing mental models and also setting realistic expectations to help users calibrate their trust to the system. And some very good examples that are doing this well. First of all, this one from the Google team, which in which they created a feature to help users decide whether it's the right time or not for people to buy their plane tickets. This was definitely before COVID that they developed this. Now, this example, I think it's super nicely linked to the previous topic of transparency and also explainability, because the team wanted to enable users to make confident decisions of when to book and really provide them with the right information to get that confidence. And there are two things that they explain to the users in this interface. First of all, they explain, hey, is this price low, medium, or high compared to those dates within other years? And at the second line underneath or above it, they're explaining how confident they are that prices might change. Now, the remarkable thing about this is that they made a very explicit choice to do that in words rather than percentages that may actually confuse the users. So they did a user test, and first they thought, hey, do we need to use a metric by saying like there's a 90% chance that prices will go up? And what they found out was that actually, having a very accurate description of, their estimation of the chance of the prices going up was confusing and less desirable for people. So they really took that feedback and changed their wording into simply very human, very understandable words. Prices will generally go up. And so, it may be less accurate in a sense, but it is a lot more understandable. Now, if you're interested in this side of human-centered AI and human-AI interaction, there are a bunch of organizations that are releasing guidelines for human-AI interaction. For example, this one by Microsoft is really good, where it gives you just like handholds, so to say, that you can use for developing your system. Like, what do you do with the initialization phase? What do you do during the interaction? What do you do over time, etc. And so those are really providing you with those considerations to take into account when creating those human AI interactions. Now, with all of this, we've briefly touched on, I think, some of the most important themes within human-centered artificial intelligence. And yeah, what I hope is that at least with this talk, you're getting a starting point for exploring how to design and build AI applications in a way that puts humans at the center. I have a bunch of more practical tools, so if anyone is interested in those, you can drop me an email or a note on LinkedIn or whatsoever, and I'll send them to you. So I don't think we'll have the time to cover those right now. But I think to wrap it all up, I hope that these are some of the things that you could see emerging from the themes that we discussed. Because first of all these topics, they're highly interdisciplinary. It's not just about computer science. I think we need to collaborate across fields like ethics and social sciences, law, design, human-computer interaction, and also really fostering inclusivity to make sure that we involve different perspectives and minimize those blind spots that we may have. And then I think the final point here is that I really think it starts with awareness, because we cannot expect everyone to be an expert in computer science or AI or data science, as well as ethics and design and everything else. You know, all of those are an entire discipline on their own, which can take years to master for a single person. But I think it does really start by being aware of some of the challenges that we face within the field, and also acknowledging that when we're making these systems, we actually have the power to influence people's lives, and whether that is for the better or for the worst.